Well, I'll let Bill start with that because he has a very interesting story.
Since I came first, I'll start first. I grew up in the South, in Alabama, in a rural town, in a family that was very evangelical and believed that Jesus was returning. And with that background, the way it affected me is I didn't really think I would ever grow up. I thought Jesus would come, and I never gave much thought to being an adult. And it was rural, and my family's first generation Americans, they're German, and none of them had gone beyond, my dad had finished high school, I think. My mother didn't get that far because she had to drop out and work. So I didn't really know anything about higher education. The school, I didn't get much help. I was not a very good, I made good grades because I was smart, but I wasn't a good student. And because I turned out I had some learning kind of disabilities. And so after a few years out of high school, I realized I had to do something, and the only thing I knew to do was go to a Bible school, which I did. And after 2 years there, I realized that I was a lot smarter than a lot of the kids there, and that I could probably get into a better school. And I ended up going to a Mississippi college, which is a Baptist school in Mississippi. And it was still segregated at that time. And by the time it was after I left that they desegregated. And I ended up being an exchange student for a year and coming back to Mississippi College and getting my bachelor's degree and having to do something because the Army was after me. They classified me 1A, and it looked like I was going to get drafted. And so I enrolled in graduate school at the University of Alabama in philosophy. And after 3 semesters there, I realized that I was getting old enough, I was turning 27 that year, that they weren't going to draft me. They had tried drafting older people, and particularly graduate students, and it wrecked the Army. And they realized that, you know, if you got some smart graduate student going up against a lifer sergeant, you know, there's no way they could do it. And I started taking a little bit of drug, marijuana, and had a real low dose of LSD one time. And it really opened my eyes a lot. And I was dropping out of school anyhow. And from Alabama, it looked like New York and San Francisco were about the same far apart from where I was. And I got a chance to go to New York for a summer, and it was the only time I've ever really lived in a city, and it drove me crazy. And I'd realized I wanted to work with my hands, that studying philosophy, which I was, the only thing you could do is academic. And I was not cut out for being in a windowless cubbyhole looking at books and trying to write. It drove me crazy. And after a summer, I realized I was in the wrong place, and I got a call from some of my friends that said, "Hey, we're going to take a trip to San Francisco. Do you want to come along?" And I was in New York, and they were at the University of Alabama. I had an old motorcycle in those days, and I rode my motorcycle back to the University of Alabama and hooked up with them, and we caravanned across country. And by the time I got to Los Angeles, I couldn't stand it, being with those people. I bailed out and went and found a cousin whose husband was a doctor in the Army and lived on an Army base for a little while to get my head kind of straight. And they all went on to San Francisco, ended up in Berkeley, and after a couple of months, I went up there. I hitchhiked up to Berkeley, and while I was there, I met a fellow who I'd met in New York who said, "Hey, I'm staying in the Haight, and I've met this guy who, with some friends, is getting a commune together. They're all from the city. None of them have a background in country, and I think you should check it out." And I did. And it turned out it was Table Mountain Ranch that they had bought. And they said, sure. They started to live in Table Mountain in the summer of 1969. And it took me till, or summer of 68 actually, it took me till New Year's Day of 69. And I moved to Table Mountain Ranch and lived there for 20 years.
So I too grew up in the South. I was born in Louisiana, in New Orleans, in the French Quarter. And the house that I was born in actually is still there. It survived Katrina. It's in one of the upper reaches of the levee and survived Katrina. But we moved to a little town where my grandmother lived and where she had a dairy farm on the Pearl River in Bogalusa. And it was on the edge of a swampland that had huge old bald cypress in the swamps, which are related to redwoods. So I grew up with a cousin to the redwoods, and as kids I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and we played there among those trees. The town was a mill town. It had been formed in around 1900 to build a mill and to log the longleaf pine that still was unentered around the 1900s. And my grandmother and grandfather had come there to do that, to help build the town. And my grandfather established a number of businesses, including a butcher shop and a grocery store and the dairy farm, and which is where they lived. And so we moved to that dairy farm, but we were very much aware of the timber industry because my father worked at the mill, and there were stories, of course, about how wonderful they were. For every tree they cut, they planted many more trees. And we loved trees as kids because we were there among them and we climbed them and loved them. And we were skeptical, even as children, of what we saw as propaganda. We knew that they were cutting the big trees and planting little trees, and it didn't replace what had been taken. So I feel in a way as though where I grew up really prepared me for coming here to these redwoods. I moved to Los Angeles, had 2 daughters, and was raising them alone in Los Angeles, and realized that I really didn't want to raise them in the city. And a friend of mine, I was teaching at an alternative school in Los Angeles, and a friend of mine whose daughter had gone to that school and who subsequently moved up here, came back down to Los Angeles to visit and said, there's an opening at the Whale School at Table Mountain Ranch in Albion for a teacher. Would you like to apply? And so I came up one weekend and interviewed and was accepted, and went back down to LA and packed us all up and moved onto the commune where Bill lived, which is where the school was located, and taught there at the school for a few years and lived on the commune. So we had gone from being this little tiny family, my 2 daughters and I, in an apartment in a big city, to living on a commune out in the country with 26 other people in a little log cabin that had, well, it wasn't a log cabin, a little cabin with boards that had no insulation, so, and cracks between them like this. So it was quite a different place to be. It was culture shock, and it took me a while to realize that this was my life, that I was indeed camping more or less permanently. I'd taken this on. And so it was there, living at Table Mountain, that I began to hear about what was going on around us in the forests with the trees and the timber companies.
Just to start where I left off, Table Mountain Ranch was an in-holding of Masonite Timber Company. It was surrounded on all four sides. It was 140 acres surrounded on all four sides by Masonite Timber Company's land. And Masonite actually had bought that land, I think, in the 1950s from Albion Lumber Company, and Albion Lumber Company had a railroad on the river here, and at one point went almost all the way to Navarro. I think it went to Navarro. And they pulled up their tracks, I believe, in the 30s, and the mill that was right here closed down here at Albion Flats under the bridge. And in the 50s, Masonite, which was a fiber company, invented Masonite board. That's what people think about, kind of a really high-tempered wood product. We're back in the Midwest somewhere, I think Chicago, and they decided to buy land in California and grow fiber, and they weren't much interested in the big trees, and actually chopped down redwoods to grow faster growing. They tried to grow eucalyptus even and stuff. But they found themselves, they'd bought all this land and they found themselves in the timber business, but they were pretty casual about it. They did build a pretty up-to-date for its time sawmill in Ukiah, and but they had not logged the land around Table Mountain since the first time. It was all second growth. And by that time, all these trees were 50, 60 years old, and the forests were beautiful. They hadn't been entered, so we were like in paradise. And then Masonite got in trouble financially. I don't know how all that went, but they somehow ended up being afraid that somebody was going to take them over for their land. So they decided they needed to sell their land, and they put it into its own company, Timber Realization Company, and put it on the market. And Louisiana Pacific had been formed by GP having, well, actually, I think it was Sierra. No, it was GP.
It was Georgia Pacific, yeah.
Georgia Pacific had to, they were being harassed about being a, what's it called, where you own everything, a monopoly.
A monopoly, yeah.
Right. They were one of the last anti-monopoly cases for a long time. And they just said, well, after they'd bought the land that became Georgia Pacific in around Fort Bragg, they said, well, we have to we'll take some of our land and we'll form another company to get to, and that was where Harry Merlo came into the picture. And they pretty much gave him a whole bunch of land. And
Who was Harry Merlo?
Harry Merlo.
Who was he? I know, but
he was the owner, pretty much, of Georgia Pacific, and his idea was we're going to log to infinity. When you start talking about the timber wars, he was one of the big players. On the other side of the war, and he was really the big player down here in Mendocino County, as to Humboldt County, where it was Hurwitz and crew. And he ended up with some money and bought all of the Masonite land. And he saw dollar signs and just went at it. And in 1989, they did a big clear cut right on the boundary of Table Mountain Ranch, and it was sickening. But by that time, I mean, Table Mountain Ranch had started in '69, and by '89, it was kind of really falling apart in terms of it, the people that lived there. People had grown a lot in 20 years and had kids and had different ideas of what they wanted to do, and we were fighting among ourselves, and we couldn't really get it together. Some people tried to get it together to oppose Masonite, and that was just when the new timber harvest rules were being implemented and all that. It was a time of change, and I didn't have time to deal with it. That was earlier than '89, though, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was in the early '80s. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
It was in the early '80s when that happened.
When Louisiana Pacific was preparing to log Enchanted Meadow, which is up the Albion River. And up to that point, all that I had done in terms of forestry work was write letters, perhaps go to a meeting or make a phone call. But with the Enchanted Meadow plan happening, and Zia Catalini really pushing to have the community involved in what was going on there, and then Earth First, Judy Berry, got involved. And so Bill and I went from being letter writers to overnight being out in the woods during the night putting up a tree sitter. And it was quite the radical change for me anyway. I had grandchildren at that point, and I was taking them to protests and sitting in front of logging gates with the grandkids and the signs and LP equals logger poverty, etc. So that was my beginning with fighting the timber industry, was Enchanted Meadow, that particular plan. And fortunately for us activists, we did get the plan stopped. We were successful. But fortunately for us, Louisiana Pacific sued us. They filed a SLAP suit against the protesters. And I thought that was a wonderful thing for them to have done, because we had to meet every week and talk about our legal strategy, and it helped get us organized. Otherwise, we would have all just gone home and been done. And as it was, we stayed on, we stayed together, we were organized, we really hooked in with Judy Berry and took it from there.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to add some.
Well, in terms of
point.
our history, I by then had a sawmill, a portable sawmill, which I still have, and I was sawing lumber for a neighbor in the neighborhood, and so when the timber wars kind of came on, it was like, well, you live in a log house or in a wood house. Why are you fighting this? And I said, well, I saw logs and I'm fighting it. You know, so it gave me some insight, though, into and some connections with people who were involved in timber. So, and at Table Mountain, one of the things I learned to do was go to meetings and how to communicate with people, really. And the theme there really was, we didn't have any religious background. It was really to be an exploration of group consciousness. And that's been one of the themes of my life from then to now, is to really understand how group consciousness works and how what about us just wants to be a sheep and follow, and what it means to be a leader and a follower, or what it means to be able to be totally an individual and be part of a group, and how do you do that. And it stood me well when it came to to really trying to get out of the timber wars, some of that. The timber wars, the whole, the great Northwest nowhere, really kind of a backwater of the United States. There's not much connection to anywhere till the back to the land movement happened. And particularly after the 1950s, when the timber crashed completely for a while, and a lot of people moved away. It was not very much populated either, but with the back to the landers buying up land here because it was cheaper, and a lot of them being educated people. It wasn't like dropouts from high school. It was dropouts from college and graduate school, and north and also the whole marijuana things. What happened with the dropouts that moved back up to this part of the country is they started growing marijuana and discovering there was an incredible market for it. And that didn't happen with us at Table Mountain, but it certainly happened a lot because we had a school. But it was a real big influence, I think, in terms of the timber wars too, because these people that moved back had bought their land cheap, were able to pay for it, and really become a part of the scenery, of the landscape. And when they realized what was going on in the timber industry, up in the north it was cutting the big trees in Humboldt County. Here in Mendocino County, it was the rapacious behavior of people like Harry Merlo. We had what we call the Albion Uprising, which happened in 1990.
1992, right.
1992.
Around Enchanted Meadow up the Albion River. So our activism really came very strongly out of the Albion. And this has been our home mine for 40 years and Bill's for 50 now, I guess, right?
Something like that.
And we feel grounded here and felt very protective of it. So when that particular plan happened, we became involved.
And that plan,
the Enchanted Meadow plan. And that plan.
Talk about it. I mean, it was right near Table Mountain. Right. It was down at the river where if you walked down the path from Table Mountain, you came to what became to be known as the Enchanted Meadow. We just called it Lord McDonald's cow pasture.
Right. And we would camp down there among the cows.
And he had had a deal with Masonite for years. He was the only person that lived upriver from here. The Albion River from here out to Comshe is not very, there's nobody that lives next to it. And he had a little homestead down there, and he ran cows.
So that was a plan where we put up tree sitters, we blockaded gates, we locked gates in various ways, and sat in front of them and got arrested and had a wonderful time. And we were sort of being the merry pranksters, and Judy Berry was singing and laughing as all of this was going on, and we were enjoying ourselves a lot actually as we protested. But one of the things I think that particularly Judy always emphasized is that we were not fighting the loggers themselves, the workers. We were really trying to take on the corporations and trying to ally ourselves actually with the workers, which was successful to a greater or lesser degree. But I remember one plan this was another plan where we were blockading the gates, and the man who was the main faller, who was the head of all the tree fallers, called the Bull Buck, and he was from Covelo, and he knew Richard Wilson, and he was over here in Albion, head of the logging crew, and he was on one side of the gate, we were on the other side of the gate. It was a standoff, and we stood them off several days in a row. So he and I got into conversation kind of morning after morning. We were able to talk to each other. And we were definitely on totally different ends of the spectrum and could not find anything that we agreed upon. But we did keep talking to each other. And finally, at the end of our standoff, he and I agreed that elderly people should be able to take their trash to the dump for free. And that was our agreement. We both believed that. We had something in common. And he had come way from the right to come to this place where anybody would get anything from the government for free. And of course it was easy for me to move to that point. And so when he left, after they did, of course, finish logging, and he left, and I saw him once again at the gate, and he said, "Linda, I just want to let you know that there are a few trees in there with blue marks on them that we didn't cut down. We left those for you." And so that was the kind of relationships that we were trying to build with people, that, you know, we know each other, we care. We do have something in common, be it ever so little a bit. And so that's one of my favorite stories from the timber wars, was that being able to reach out and connect with the other side, who really was not the other side.
By the time that the Albion Uprising, as we called it, happened, which was the whole community getting up in arms and supporting changing things. It was a really, really incredible trip. By the time that happened, Judy Berry had been bombed, and this was the first time. She lived in Laytonville, Leggett, somewhere over there, and the person, Zia Catalini, who was a local neighbor, who had really taken on the Enchanted Meadow, this plan herself. She lived right next to where they were going to do it. She invited Judy to come over, and it was Judy's first time since after the bombing. And that whole history, the bombing happened a couple of years earlier and almost killed Judy and kept her from being at the big rally which we had in Fort Bragg. That was the year of the Redwood Summer, when they had invited people out here. This is kind of going backwards in history. But the two movements, the one up in Humboldt and with Judy Berry, who actually lived in northern Mendocino, and what was happening on the coast were really separate. And we were just, tired of having our second growth ripped off, and they had the big redwood trees and the big tree sits and that kind of stuff. But in that sense, we were kind of a stepchild of that, I would say. But we also had our own. It gave us room to have our own center. There had been people locally who, more than doing direct actions and civil disobedience, had started to take on the paper trail. And that, so it was more of a fight the bureaucracy, or try and work with the bureaucracy and the laws rather than sit in trees. And that was true, actually, of Zia Catalini. And then what had happened by then was the Mendocino, what is it called, the center in Ukiah?
The MEC, the Mendocino Environmental Center.
The Mendocino.
In Ukiah.
Right.
Was up and running.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, just that, Bill's quite right that one of the things that I got into, because I'm sort of nerdy and can sit at a desk and read boring documents, is I got into timber harvest plan review and challenge things through the bureaucracies, and tried to develop relationships actually with the people in the bureaucracies, and would go every week to meetings in Willits or Ukiah where they reviewed timber harvest plans. And I went to Willits and or Ukiah once a week for probably 10 years, reviewing timber harvest plans. And I, at that time, looked at almost every timber harvest plan in Mendocino County that was submitted in Mendocino County. I got to know the forest practice rules. I found a lawyer. The first THP that I looked at, I decided I wanted to sue on that timber harvest plan. And so I called the MAC and I said, can you give me the name of a lawyer? And they did that, and I called that lawyer up. I was brand new at all of this, and I said, would you file a lawsuit on this timber harvest plan for me? And he said, yes. And I said, would you do it for free? And he said, yes. And that was the beginning of my relationship with this lawyer, who was our lawyer, or my lawyer, our lawyer locally, for many years. And so that was one of the ways that we took on what we call the timber beast.
Who was that? Who was the lawyer?
His name is Paul Carroll, and he lives in Redwood City, and is certainly one of my heroes. He was a ballet dancer. He realized his body was not going to last till he was 99, and he decided to go to law school and get a law degree. He went to the University of Virginia and did that, moved out here, and started doing law work. It was criminal work that he was doing, but he was a good guy. He had 2 children who he sent to alternative schools. They went barefoot, even though they lived at the time in Palo Alto and were well-to-do people. And he was very respectful of other people. And I love that about him, that when we were in court, or when we were in conferences with the other side, or even when we were amongst ourselves, he really was the gentleman and would speak. He would always seek out the person who was the least powerful or the least forward presenting in the group and speak to them and bring them into the conversation. I loved his values, and he did work for us, not always for free, but certainly for reduced rates. And without him, we wouldn't have been able to do what we did. And we learned a lot about the rules and about how to manage that. But we didn't isolate ourselves, because Paul also believed that what influenced judges was what was going on politically. So we were closely allied, we being the Albion River Watershed Protection Association, who brought these lawsuits. We were closely allied with Earth First, and we worked together to create situations that would influence the political sphere and influence judges when they came to make decisions. But Paul, although he represented us with all of his intellect, he was a very bright guy, didn't really think, and I think this goes to what people who are outside of the region believe. He lived in Palo Alto, and he really didn't believe that we were being quite accurate. He thought we were being a bit overwrought about what we were saying about the timber companies and about what was happening up here. And it took him, although he was intimately involved, it took him several years to realize that the things that the activists had been saying were true, that our lands were being over-harvested, overlogged. So that's what I wanted to add about Paul. And so he came up actually to one of our meetings, and he had written a poem to us, and he read the poem, and it was sort of his confession of and his homage to us. So that was really nice. Yeah.
We had this forest that you could access. You could walk for miles just across country. One of the first things I did when I was at Table Mountain Ranch was I got lost. Well, I realized that the lay of the land was such that if I walked in a certain direction, I would come to Albion Ridge Road because the road kind of made a loop. And I thought, well, one Sunday afternoon I'll do that. And I walked for hours up one hill, down another. and there was never any brush in the way. You know, I never had to beat my way through anything. And once they got in and started cutting, that was done. You just can't walk in the woods like you could then. I don't know if that was healthy for the woods or not. I mean, it was a second growth redwood forest. I'm sure it could take care of itself, but it probably wasn't in any hurry to, you know, it figured it had 1,000 years to get itself back to where it wanted to be, I suspect, you know. But that was where I saw the biggest changes. And then with the fish, that was where people really became aware of what was happening in our rivers, was that the fish were disappearing. And then when you start looking, and like anything, it takes time to learn to look, just like Linda was saying about Paul. There's a process, you know. And over the years, one of the things I've tried to, well, we both have, we've really educated ourselves in a lot of ways. But for me, it really has to do with the kind of stuff foresters learn about, and, you know, and biologists and botanists and that thing, and not so much all the names of things, but being able to look at something and say, oh, this is what happened here. You know, this stream was driven down by a caterpillar. You know, caterpillars drug logs through here, and now the water is 20 feet under the ground. There's still a creek down there, but you know, it's not accessible to anything. That sort of thing.
I've lived where I live for 40 years, and when I first moved there were owls, all kinds of owls. And the land around me now has been heavily logged, and there aren't those owls anymore. There are many fewer birds than there were when I moved there. And I don't think that makes a case because it's one little area, but that was my observation, that things were changing in my backyard when we live right on the Mendocino Redwood Company boundary line. And so things were changing literally in my backyard. And I could see that, hear that.
Linda and I we really formed a team where Linda did all this work to agencies and stuff, and I had my sawmill and kept home, you know, kept us in food and shelter and that sort of thing. And it works really well. We've done that. That has been kind of our life in a lot of ways. I like to go to meetings. That's the part where I feel like we can do well. But I'm not good at taking on jobs and following through on them. Very hard time with that. I don't like to read a lot of paper or that sort of thing. But through our work, we were realizing that while we were having success legally and success actually changing things, they were still winning in terms of the timber wars, even though it wasn't active. They were still winning. Louisiana Pacific had finally thrown in the towel and said they were going to sell, and we had realized that the only way you could really, in our system of property ownership, and said, if the land was public, you might have some say about it. If it would belong to the government, like Jackson State, you could have some say about it. Jackson State's a state forest, 20,000 acre state forest. You could have some success, but unless you owned it, you couldn't tell people what to do. And even if you went to court and won on some legal ground, they could come back and cut it and that sort of thing. So when Louisiana Pacific announced they wanted to sell, someone said, well, it came up that there were some, Charles Peterson or someone had found out that there were some people that were talking about during that time when land wasn't that expensive, actually, that it might be possible just by getting a better interest rate make it feasible to buy some of these cut over lands and let them grow back, that they would grow back fast enough to cover the interest and principal over time, and you might but it would take a change in the tax laws. But then, so that was kind of exciting, and then I think it was Charles Peterson that realized that if we were going to do this, Charles Peterson was actually our 5th district supervisor at that time, that if we were going to do this, it would have to be a community effort. It couldn't just be the environmentalists try to do that. And it couldn't be just some do-good there was no do-good timber owners that we knew about. That we'd have to come together, and he invited lots of people, and you can go over some of that if you want.
Well, we met at Henry Gunling's house.
Yeah.
It was our first meeting, and Charles Peterson was the person who gathered us. And for me, it was a bombshell that Joe Euphrat, I believe it was, who came up with the idea, and I don't know particularly who he was, although he was involved in financial sorts of things, came up with the idea of tax-exempt bonds and buying these lands through bonds and managing them for the public benefit. And that idea hit this county like, as I said, a bombshell. People were so excited about the idea of us being able to own and manage. I mean, all the time that we were doing what we were doing, sitting in trees, commenting on timber harvest plans, suing, trying to change regulations, and knowing that we were failing, to have this idea come to us that there could be something democratic. And that was always a word that I thought about when I was doing Timber Harvest Review, was how undemocratic this is, that the people who are affected, including the workers, really didn't have a say in how things around them were being handled. And certainly the environmentalists didn't, and neither did anybody else. The major timber corporations ruled. And so to have this idea that we ourselves could own the land, own some forest land, and manage it the way we knew it could be managed, really ran across this county, I think, like wildfire, at least through the environmental community. People were so excited. And the first meeting was at Henry Gunling's house in Philo. And the people who were gathered were supposed to be a cross-section of people from the community, and so there was Charles Peterson, who was our supervisor, and Art Harwood, who was our very own timber beast, and then there were Bill and me, who were from Earth First, and there were foresters, but there we were, and I know that I sat across the table from Art and glared at Art when we got started, because he was the timber beast in my mind. But it was a wonderfully exciting time. So hopeful and optimistic.
And that led us into forming what eventually became the Redwood Forest Foundation Incorporated. That was one of the first things we went through, was coming up with a name. And that was the one I think that the financial people kind of came up with, because they wanted it to be a foundation, but they wanted it to obviously be something that was incorporated, a business, or more than just a nonprofit. We left that meeting very excited with this idea, and with the idea of really trying to work together, because that's certainly something that in my mind was always important too. I mean, that was the whole idea of the commune in ways, was figuring out how to get along with people and make a society that worked together and worked for everyone. It turned out to be a long process. Turned out that we needed, in order to do this, we needed to actually get the tax laws changed. We created the Redwood Forest Foundation, Incorporated, and Henry, I believe it was, managed to get a grant from a friend of his for, I believe, $100,000 or something.
Yes.
And that was a new one to me, to be working with somebody that had money. I've always I've not been much interested in money in my life. I've always got by. Like I said at the beginning, that I never really believed I had a future, so I've never spent my time thinking about the future.
You didn't have to save up for it.
I didn't have to save up for it, no. And I never did, for that matter. So
back to Reffy.
Back to Reffy. What came out of this is we realized we had to have meetings. And since we had a bit of a budget, we could find a place and eat lunch together. And I think we met once a month for quite a while. And spent time on various subjects, but really the main thing was getting to know each other,
right,
and getting to trust each other. And we talked about forestry and how we wanted to do it. It was a lot about whether we were ever going to get the funding that we needed, whether the scheme that we started with turned out that there was a California congressman that was really opposed to it, and Plumbo was his name. Yeah, and he kind of put the kibosh on that. And of course, Reffy, Louisiana Pacific sold this land to Mendocino Redwood Company, and they were going to do a better job than Louisiana Pacific. And in the timber wars kind of died down, particularly getting Louisiana Pacific out of the picture and getting the Redwood National Park that established up there. But some of us were, we were very concerned still about wanting to. There was still, for one thing, there was still Louisiana Pacific, who was going about their merry way and never paid any attention to anybody. We couldn't ever get any traction in fighting them because they just shined us on. On occasion, Linda did bring some successful lawsuits. One against our good friend Bob Ballard, who
had written a plan on Salmon Creek, and I think that was the first one I sued on, actually, and we won. And Bob said, Linda, I can't believe you did that. That was the best plan I ever wrote. But anyway, so yeah, and I think that yes, the feature of Reffy for me in the early days was trying to build that sense of trust. And I think that Art was really instrumental in keeping us on track as much as was possible. And he said that if every one of us does not agree on something, we haven't succeeded. And Art, at least in those days, didn't define success as having purchased a piece of land. He defined success as the group of us being able to talk together and work together and begin to trust each other. And so for him, we were a success when we reached that point. And I think we did, to some degree, come to at least know and respect each other, and not be quite so at odds.
So one year kind of went after another, it turned out, and we kept meeting, and we kept making progress. We got our paperwork together. We became an organization that could buy and manage timber, for a nonprofit that could buy and manage timberland for public benefit. That was one of the things we really accomplished, using some of Henry's found money, and got to know each other better, and like I said, talked about ways that we could manage land and what a management plan would look like that we could all agree on. But after 10 years, it was beginning to look like, well, I always felt like we succeeded. Well, I've always felt like it, it tends to be, I think I tend to be kind of that kind of a person that, yes, we've really done something here. The fact that we came together was, it's a success. And we've met for this time, and we've really explored an idea and followed through on it as far as we possibly could. Somebody was wanting to pipe water out of the Albion and gather it up in giant bladders,
bags,
inflatable bag off the coast, and ship it down, tow it down to San Diego and sell it. And he actually had started some paperwork trying to get permission to do this. And so we started to find out details about it. Yeah.
Well, someone called and said, Linda, a permit, don't know if you know, but a permit has been submitted by someone to take water out of the Albion and put it in big bags and take it down the coast. And I said, ha, ha, ha. That's such a silly idea. That this must be a tall tale, or that you're telling me. But they said, no, no, no. And I think in those days we were still faxing. They faxed me a copy of this permit, and there it was. Someone had applied to the water board to extract water from the Albion and the Walla rivers. And I thought, well, we got to get on this one right away. So Bill happened to be going to a meeting of a group of people in the Albion who were talking about watershed issues. And I said, Bill, I'm going to write you up a little quarter sheet flyer alert about this, and take it to the meeting and hand it out. So Bill took it to the meeting, he handed it out, alert, water bagger coming to town to take our water. And one of the women at that meeting was with the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations. And she had a big list of people that she sent notices and announcements to. And she said, oh, I'll put this on that list. She did that. The next day, the Associated Press called me because I was the contact on it. And so that's how it really went national immediately, because it was such an outrageous thing to think that someone was going to take our water and put it in football field-sized bags and tug it down the coast. And there was immediate opposition up and down the coast. The Farm Bureau was now good buddies with us, environmentalists, because they opposed it too. But the other people, of course, who were involved were the people at Sea Ranch, because the Walla River was the other river that he wanted water from. And that's how we met Don Kemp, was through resisting that effort. We were successful. The water bagger did not take our water, and we knew Don.
We met him through that. He would come to meetings, and we would start talking. And he turned out that he was also from Louisiana. And so he and Linda kind of had an instant connection. Right. And it turned out that he was really looking. After it didn't take too long, the water bag thing, it took a year.
It took a year.
I thought it was really fun because by that time we'd had enough experience with protests and changing things to have a pretty good idea how it was going to go. And we immediately realized that this one we'd won from the beginning. We could just relax and have fun. And after a year, we were at a meeting, and go ahead, you started talking to him about.
Well, I was talking to Don, and this was all done. And he said, oh, well, now what am I going to do? I don't have a project. And I said, aha, I have something that you might be interested in. And I started talking to him about the Redwood Forest Foundation and invited him to a meeting.
So Don Kemp was a money guy, turned out. He had retired, although he was quite young, from my perspective. He'd retired to the Sea Ranch from New York, and when it turned out he was interested in the Redwood Forest Foundation, the other thing that was happening during that time was through various efforts that we had done with the Redwood Forest Foundation, particularly the state park at Mendocino, the Big River State Park, I don't know, 12,000 acres or something, had happened, and one of the people that had come up was that we had met through that. We were involved not in the negotiations for the park, but in the protests that led Campbell to consider selling it. One of the people that came up was a fellow that was with Coast Conservation Fund.
All right, Chris.
Chris.
That's where we met Chris.
Yeah, a conservation fund, and he had been interested in the park and helping get that funded, and found out that Campbell also wanted to sell the land in Big River that was upstream from the park. And also we'd talked to him about Redwood Forest Foundation, and he decided that maybe the Conservation Fund themselves could try something like that. They had money, and they weren't so community oriented, but they were very interested in forestry and the idea of buying this land, and mostly what they'd done do is buy land and hold it for a little while and put conservation easements on it and sell it. But he was intrigued by buying and holding this land and managing it, and he bought. They ended up buying the Big River tract, and we talked him into buying Salmon Creek in the Albion with the Redwood Forest Foundation. So when Don Kemp came on, Campbell had made this deal with Chris and the Conservation Fund, and we're looking to sell more land in that way of it gave them a good name, and that's kind of when Don came on, and he gave the banks comfort that we could not do. It turned out that I don't know, like I said, this is kind of where Linda and I get out of the story. Linda had been an actual member of the board. I never was. I was always advisory. I'm not a board member kind of fellow. I wouldn't do my part.
You were the chaplain.
I was a chaplain. Yeah, but
You prayed for us all.
but Don gave them comfort that and was able to communicate with the Bank of America, which Campbell wanted to bring on to do this. As far as I was never clear on it, but it looked to me like Campbell and the Bank of America were in cahoots, and they were good friends, to just put it that way, you know. And if Campbell wanted the Bank of America to finance this, and Bank of America could get comfort that it would work, they would go along with it. And Don was a very important part of that because he understood all that language and had experience with it.
And I think that's where Bill and I then moved away from RFFI, because our constituents were Earth Firsters and hippies and so on, and the Bank of America and Campbell Timber Company were the enemy. And then Campbell being the manager, we felt we had no leverage at all to really make changes in the forest. It seemed as though the vision had sort of died at that point for us, that we weren't going to be able to fulfill what we saw.
And I still thought it was a success, because by God, we'd got out of the hands of, we had the title,
Right.
and instead of having to try and stop somebody from doing something, they were going to have to take it away from us, and that seemed like a much stronger position than we'd ever been in before. And that's how I feel now, that they'd have to take it away from us now. It's ours.
Yeah, we fell away from RFFI, and it wasn't until really RFFI got its own timber management team, and got rid of Campbell essentially, and that we felt that we might be able to realize some of our vision for the forest, which, as far as I could tell what Campbell was doing, we went out on some of those timber harvest plans, and were shown around by Campbell people what was going on out there, and it was dreadful to us. It was hard to stomach that they were cutting these beautiful young redwood trees that should be left to grow. That was the capital, that was the future. And so we couldn't be involved until Campbell was gone. They were gatekeepers. And it was certainly not my idea of democracy or involvement of the people that we had to go and ask now, still asking the timber companies for permission. And it was even worse in a way because before, Bill and I, and still, feel quite okay about trespassing. We feel that these forests are ours and that we have a right to go onto them. So then to be in a situation to be associated with a group that was having to ask permission to go, we just couldn't quite go there until they were gone.
At the same time, well, I don't want to overstate it. We stayed involved with RFFI any way we could. Eventually, that we were able to peacefully break up with the Campbell group, and it's wonderful to me now. Whether we get it right or not, I don't know. But we got the chance to try, and we'll see.
And I think that even during that time, I certainly had a lot of admiration for the people on the board who were hanging in there. I didn't feel that I could, and I admired that they did and were seeing it through. And that was a long, hard slog for the board, and that was good work on their part.
Art Harwood always said that what we're doing is making a template or something like that. Redwood Forest Foundation, the idea of it wasn't to own 50,000 acres. It was to have a way of gathering timberland under nonprofit management, and that's still a dream to me. That it's great that we have this 50,000 acres that's so far away from me that I can't be involved in hardly at all. But the idea of it expanding and getting that land paid off, we haven't met the original, our original vision yet by a long shot. We finally figured out how to pay for this land, we hope. With carbon credits and the better timber prices. But getting to that point where it truly is a valuable community asset is really exciting to me. and continuing, like I said, to find land to purchase.
And I guess my vision for the future is moving toward that healthy forest and being able to include people in the community in moving forward. And that right now, and it's something that we're working on, of course, is the Native American people and bringing them back onto the land in ways that are good for them and us. And somehow demonstrating, being able to take people out on our forest and say, look what we did. You know, there's your pileated woodpecker up in that tree, and there's your spotted owl over there. I really want to see that day. And I may never see it, but that's my vision for this forest.